You know, a country's economic plan is really only as strong as the system that runs it. We can talk all day about taxes, spending, and growth, but if the underlying structure is shaky, even the best ideas are pretty much destined to fail. So let's dig into the hidden architecture that really determines whether a nation's economy stands tall or just comes crashing down.
So, why is that? Why do some national budgets seem to crumble before the ink is even dry? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, goes way deeper than just the numbers on a spreadsheet. It's all about the very architecture of governance itself. All right, so let's start with the blueprint. Every single government, when it's designing its fiscal policy, is basically trying to pull off a high-wire balancing act. It's this fundamental trade-off that sits right at the very heart of managing an economy.
Now, this visualizes that core tension perfectly. The best way to think about it is like your own household budget. You've got to have the discipline to save for the future, to pay down your debts. But you also need the flexibility to handle an emergency, right? A sudden car repair or a leaky roof. A country's economy, it's really no different.
Okay, let's break this down a bit. On one side of the scale, you've got flexibility. This is the government's ability to react, to fight a recession, respond to a disaster, or make big, strategic investments in things like roads and schools. Then, on the flip side, you have discipline. These are the rules of the road, things like debt limits and deficit rules, that keep things from getting out of control and make sure the country stays financially stable for the long haul. But here's the thing, and this is absolutely crucial. None of this works without a solid foundation. You can have the most brilliant rules on paper, but if the institutions in charge aren't credible, if the rules aren't transparent, and if there's no real power to enforce them, that whole balancing act is just going to come crashing down.
Okay, so we've got our blueprint, but how does that plan actually get built? This brings us to what you might call the construction machinery. It's called the Public Financial Management System, or PFM for short, and it is the process that brings the entire budget to life. So, this PFM system works in 5 key stages. First up, the budget is prepared. You figure out what you need and what you expect to earn. Second, it has to be approved, usually by a parliament or Congress. Third is execution. This is where the money actually gets spent. Fourth, you have reporting, which tracks where all that money went. And finally, you have audit and oversight, where independent groups come in and check if the money was spent legally and well.
And what's so important to see here is that this isn't a straight line. It's a continuous, year-round cycle. What you learn from the audit of one year's budget directly feeds into the planning for the next one. When the cycle is humming along smoothly, it's the engine of a healthy fiscal system. But what happens when something gets inside and starts chewing up the gears?
And that brings us to the villain of our story, corruption. And we're not just talking about a few bad apples here. Think of it more like termites in the walls, a destructive force that silently eats away at the entire structure from the inside.
And man, it is relentless. It doesn't just hit one part of the system. No, it attacks the budget from every single angle, weakening both its foundation and its framework. This chart right here, it's basically a damage report. It shows you exactly how corruption acts like a poison that just seeps into the system, distorting everything it touches. So let's trace the path of destruction, shall we? First off, it chokes off the income. Because of things like bribery and mass tax evasion, less money is coming in the door to begin with. Then, it messes with the spending. Money that should be going to hospitals and schools gets diverted into huge, murky projects where, let's be honest, it's way easier for connected insiders to get their cut.
But the damage doesn't stop there. The ripple effects are huge. Corruption means higher costs, since contracts get padded to pay for kickbacks. This, of course, destroys trust. And when people feel like the system is rigged, why would they want to pay their taxes? That's what they call a collapse in tax morale. All of this forces the government to borrow money at higher interest rates. At the end of the day, corruption is so much more than theft. It's a tax on the entire country's future.
So how do you fight an enemy that thrives in the dark? Simple. You flip on the lights. And that brings us to the first and maybe the most powerful line of defense: fiscal transparency.
So what is fiscal transparency? Well, in a nutshell, it's about making government financial information open, clear, and easy for everybody to access, not just the experts. It's about pulling back the curtain so we can all see exactly where our money is coming from, where it's going, and start asking the tough questions. But here's the key thing to remember. Transparency isn't just about dumping a bunch of spreadsheets online and calling it a day. It's about creating a whole ecosystem of accountability. You empower citizens and journalists to follow the money.
You give investors clear, honest reports so they can assess risks. And you arm independent watchdogs like audit offices with the info they need to hold power to account. Real transparency turns data into action.
And that brings us to the final and, honestly, the most important piece of this whole puzzle. All of it, that balancing act, the PFM cycle, all this transparency, none of it matters if it isn't built on one single non-negotiable foundation: institutional integrity.
I really want to let this quote sink in because it is the absolute core of what we're talking about. Fiscal outcomes are as much a function of institutional integrity as of economic logic. So what does that really mean? It means the character of your institutions, the people, the culture, that matters every bit as much as the numbers on a spreadsheet.
I mean, think about it, right? If you don't have integrity, what happens? All those systems we just talked about, they just become a show. The fiscal rules are just words on paper that everyone ignores. The budgets get published, but they're not real. And transparency becomes a total illusion, just another box for politicians to tick.
So you see, this is so much bigger than just an economic problem. It's not about wasted money or a few percentage points of GDP. The ultimate price you pay for weak integrity, it's the complete erosion of public trust. That's the very glue holding the relationship between a government and its citizens together. And when that's gone, the entire structure starts to wobble.
And so that leaves us with one final big question to think about. When that bond is broken, when citizens just stop believing in the fairness or the effectiveness of the system that governs them, what's the real cost? Not just in dollars and cents, but to a society's entire future.